So the first question that I chose was explain how the war changed America during and after the war. So the war changed America kind of in three different ways, economically, socially, and politically. Um, so before the war, America was suffering through the Great Depression, and that took a lot of toll on the country just as a whole because they were struggling economically, they were struggling with job opportunities and employment, they were struggling with, civilians being fed, they were just struggling in general, and so this war kind of pulled them out of that. So economically, the government massively increased their spending to accommodate producing all of the weapons, vehicles, ships and supplies needed for war. And so this huge industrial demand created so many job opportunities for so many people. And this just helped the economic system significantly. And so the piece of evidence that I found in the textbook was this involvement is what definitively ended the Great Depression and ushered the biggest economic boom. I chose that piece just because it was very straightforward and it really told us exactly what pulled them out of the Great Depression and how these factors helped. And so with that being said, all of the job opportunities created gave women an opportunity to work in male-dominated fields. And so this was pretty significant because it finally gave them an opportunity to just show everybody that they are perfectly capable of, performing all of the duties that the men would do with no problems at all. And this eventually did help ignite the Civil Rights Act and everything like that. This is also where Rosie the Riveter became as prominent, is because women took place of the men in these male-dominated workforces because they were fighting the war. And so then the U.S. kind of became known for supplying weapons, and that was just their biggest contribution to war in general, was the military and industrial aspect of things, because they were just very involved in putting out all of these materials needed, and that's kind of what they were known for, I guess. But in general, the war created such a massive economic boom because there was just so much demand for everything that they needed, and then the government spending also helped create all of these things, and then created jobs for everybody else. So leading into my next question, it was explain why the 1920s was a time of heated culture wars and how these conflicts related to World War One. So this was kind of all about social disruption and, modern versus traditionalism and all of those values. Not everyone wanted modernization, I guess. Some people were very, very set on keeping traditional values. With that being said, that kind of included women not being in the workforce and, just what they previously were, they didn't want to change. And so that's kind of what happened there. We saw women entering the workforce, which were in male-dominated positions, and people did not like that very much, and so that's kind of what happened. But the evidence that I found that supports that is also from the textbook. It says industrial labor, an occupational sphere dominated by men, shifted in part to women for the duration of the war. And so, like I said previously, that was very straightforward in telling us that industrial labor was taken over by women. And so that's kind of what sparked the modernism versus traditional values that people didn't or did like. So, yes. And then the two sides were fighting against those lifestyles. The people that were modernization were more rural, older. They didn't want rapid changes to end America's moral foundations, if that makes sense. They wanted to keep America's traditional values, and so they thought that that would affect that. And then the modernization values was embracing ideas about things such as psychology, and then they also supported consumerism and a more urban lifestyle, and so that's kind of where that came from. Those people were more younger, you could say. So that's a little bit about them. And then going into my last one was explain the Manhattan Project and how this project was kept so secret. So the Manhattan Project was a top secret U.S. government research project that developed during World War II, which was responsible for creating the first atomic bombs. This began in 1942, and so this was a very, very secretive operation. Even employees were kind of told nothing. They were told the bare minimum of what they needed to know to perform their duties. And then there were multiple facilities dispersed all over, one which being in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And then they also used code names. And so these are kind of some factors on how they kept this project so secretive. Nobody just really knew what was going on to begin with. But with that being said, it says, do you think it was necessary and or justified for America to drop two atomic bombs on Japan? And so, yes, it was, but it also wasn't. So there's two arguments to this. Some think that it should have been done because they needed to end the war and just save more lives in the long run. And then also, some people argue no, it was not necessary because of how many casualties there were. And Japan was already nearly defeated, and so it just caused so much harm and so much death with Japan that some people were just very against it. And so for my opinion, I think that I would lean more towards no, it wasn't necessary, just because I'm just not a very violent person myself, and so I just don't think that all of the casualties and all of the destruction was, worth that, because I found in the textbook that it also said about 180,000 people were killed and the nature of warfare was forever changed. And so that's what I read in the textbook, and I just don't think that all of those casualties were worth it, especially two atomic bombs, because one is already so much damage. So that's kind of my stance on it. And then okay, So then the other question was, why has the use of atomic bombs against Japan often been considered the beginning of the Cold War? So I guess a short answer to this would be just all of the tension that was between them, because it's just when there's two countries that have so much power, and there's so much tension between them, it's kind of just an arms race in a sense, you know. And so with that being said, the Soviet Union also began developing their own atomic bomb. And so then it kind of became a competition in a sense. So yeah, those are all of my questions.